Good evening. Tonight, we'll talk about being a child in the 14th century. It was sticky, loud, occasionally terrifying, somehow still hilarious. I'm your narrator, Lord Theobald Everla, and I wasn't meant to stay in Elmbrook that day. A broken cart, a miserable storm, and a dozen squawking hens changed my plans. What I found there, among the goats, gruel and gobsmacking amount of mud, was something I hadn't seen in a long while. Childhood. Real childhood. Not the kind stuffed into silence and Latin, but the elbow-swinging, snot-covered sort that teaches survival before it teaches manners. But before we begin, let me know in the comments, where are you in the world? And what time is it as you drift off with me tonight? It's always nice to know that you're not alone at this time of the night. Subscribe if you enjoy falling asleep with me. It was the kind of rain that didn't fall. It slouched, like it couldn't be bothered, but was determined to soak you anyway. Our journey was meant to take 2 days, maybe 3, through gentle hills and into the quiet safety of Lord Winvell's estate. But that was before the axle broke, and the wheels resigned from duty with the melodrama of a jilted actor. My steward, loyal but constantly damp, informed me that the nearest village was a half-mile downhill. So we descended, cartless, and splattered into a place called Elmbrook. It's a kind of place not important enough to be taxed frequently, but just unfortunate enough to be remembered during census season. Elmbrook did not boast an inn, or a square, anything that might have suggested leisure had ever visited. What it did have was a manor barn belonging to the local reeve, which smelled of hay, manure, and what I can only describe as fermented turnip breath. I slept atop my cloak with only my dignity and a moderately dented helmet for company. My entourage, a groom, a cook, a useless nephew, and a dog named Valor who barked at puddles, made do in the loft above. I suspect the dog was the warmest. It was in that barn, on that thoroughly tragic night, that I met the children of Elmbrook. Rather, they met me by screaming directly into my ear as they chased a chicken through the hay. There were 5 of them, possibly 7. It's hard to say when they moved so fast, and all wore the same expression, gleeful malice. Now, I do realize some of you might pause at that phrase, gleeful malice. Let me clarify. It's the kind of look only children possess when their joy is directly proportional to someone else's discomfort. A mixture of pure delight and low-level menace. It's like when a toddler throws a turnip at your shin and laughs with angelic innocence. Yes, but that's what I meant. They appeared at every meal, often holding something sticky or half-live. They ran circles around the livestock, shrieked at goats, and shared one crust of bread like it was sacred. I watched them, at first, with the kind of detachment one reserves for poorly trained animals. But something about their energy, their stubborn, joy-soaked filth, it nagged at me. They laughed without caution, threw mud like they were paid for it. They reminded me of something I'd forgotten. One afternoon, during yet another relentless drizzle, I took shelter beneath the eave of the barn. A bowl of something loosely defined as stew in my lap. My cook had attempted to reheat it over a sad-looking fire, while the groom argued with my nephew about whether chickens could be trained to deliver messages. Valor had found a dead vole and was enjoying the afternoon far more than anyone else. And that's when I noticed him. A boy. 9, maybe ageless children here seemed born old, stood a few paces off, in the mud, in the rain, just watching me. No expression, no fear. Just chewing on something I sincerely hope was a piece of bark. He had the nerve to just stand there like I was the oddity, like I was in an entertainment show. It's not the other way around. We locked eyes for a moment, and I'll admit I nearly asked his name. But the absurdity of a nobleman in damp stockings starting up polite, conversation with a child covered in goose feathers and mystery goo was too much. So instead I nodded. He blinked, and then very slowly he grinned, a grin that said, "You don't scare me." And just like that, he ran off shrieking after a chicken. Something about it knocked loose a memory, one I hadn't visited in years. Must have been around the same age. Back at my family's estate, larger, colder, and filled with shadows that never seemed to move. I had a governess with the warmth of a stone bench, and a father who only spoke to me in verb stand. Speak, Bo. There was a dog I adored, a hound named Giles. And one winter, while I was reading out loud from a book of saints, I heard Giles yelp. He'd broken into the kitchen and was caught stealing a bone. The punishment was swift. The cook was proud. My father said it taught discipline. But I had nightmares about it for years. I remember staring at that page of saints, unable to read a word. Because my hands were shaking so hard, I dropped the book. I never quite got over the lesson that day. That affection had limits. That love could be revoked if a rule was broken. That everything good was conditional, and perhaps that's why, when that boy stared at me, soaked, dirty, fearless, I felt something strange. Not pity, not envy, just confusion. At how someone with so little could look so absolutely unbothered. Back home, my own children, 2 boys and a girl, were quiet, pale, and painfully proper. They spoke Latin at supper. They bowed to the cook. They flinched whenever the family tutor cleared his throat. She did often, and with a tone that could curdle milk. The boys, Edmund and Hugh, are already being measured for shoes they'll grow into, and titles they likely won't. Edmund has a gaze like he's already rehearsing his will. Hugh speaks only when prompted, and always in phrases borrowed from scripture or etiquette scrolls. And the girl, Isolde. She curtsies when no one is looking. She carries a doll that never seems to change clothes, and when she smiles, it's the kind of smile you'd expect from a prisoner who's memorized their escape route but hasn't yet run. They are good children, exceptionally well behaved. But in the quiet of Elmbrook, I began to wonder if they were being raised to be statues, noble, cold, immobile. For the first time in years, I let my mind wander beyond what they do and began to ask what they feel. Do they laugh when I'm not there? Do they whisper secrets into the hedgerows? Or have they already learned far too early that joy must be portioned and curiosity kept behind the teeth? Watch the village children for 3 days. During chores, during meals, during the strange hour before dusk, when everything turns gold and even pigs look majestic. And the more I watched, the more I realized they weren't just surviving, they were living. No lace, no Latin, just mud, shrieks, and the occasional bite from a wayward duck. And somewhere in all of that noise, I remembered being young. Now, I must speak on sleep, or whatever parody of it children experience when raised in a cottage the size of a modern broom closet in Elmbrook. The children did not sleep. They collapsed like felled trees. There was no bedtime. There was simply the moment when enough yelling had happened that silence became physically necessary. They didn't drift into dreams like cherubs nestled in blankets. They face-planted into straw pallets, as if fleeing from consciousness itself. They slept in piles, human heaps, 5 of them on a sack of straw so worn it had probably seen 3 generations. The blanket, and I use that term with great hesitation, was a sort of communal rectangle of sadness, burlap stitched with wool, hay and what I believe was old cabbage skin. They lay sideways, diagonally, entangled, occasionally punching each other in their dreams. One snored. One chewed in his sleep. One muttered bread repeatedly like a tiny, haunted baker. Now, I don't claim noble childhoods were luxurious. Far from it. My room in the east wing of my father's manor had a bed of wood and stuffed goose feathers. Yes, but the feathers poked through with such vengeful precision that I still have a quill scar on my thigh. My bedchamber was also positioned conveniently. Between the chapel bell and my father's nightly indigestion, both of which ensured sleep occurred only in intervals and privacy. Ha! The very idea would have earned a laugh from my governess, who used to announce her arrival with the subtlety of a trumpet, and then proceed to lecture me on the sins of idleness while adjusting my nightcap. But I digress. Peasant sleep was something else entirely. There were no bedtime stories, no lullabies. The soundscape was pigs, wind, and the occasional slap of someone rolling into a wall. The hearth fire, which during the day was the very soul of the home, had to be extinguished or smothered by curfew, lest it burn the entire place down while someone dreamed of cheese. And of course, the bedding, if you dared call it that, was infested. Lice, fleas, and on occasion, something that resembled a beetle with ambitions. The children didn't swat these creatures away, they incorporated them. It's like unwilling bedfellows who occasionally nibbled their scalp. They had no pillows, just each other's elbows, knees, and the occasional goat who wandered too close. I watched them one night from the barn window, all curled in the corner. One child sneezed directly into the blanket and then pulled it lovingly over her sibling's face. There was a kind of violent tenderness to it. Oddly enough, it worked. They slept, loudly, contorted like old parchment. But they slept. Meanwhile, I was wide awake, lying on a rolled-up saddlebag while Valor tried to steal my cloak. What struck me, and this may sound absurd, was how comfortable they looked. Not physically, obviously. The arrangement screamed tetanus, but there was something emotionally comfortable about the way they accepted their shared misery. It was communal. It's like bad sleep was a village sport, and they were all on the same losing team. Compare that, if you will, to a modern child, flung into a bed that costs more than my entire dowry did, surrounded by lavender diffusers and anxiety. About screen time, I've seen my own son need 3 specific pillows before he can even consider closing his eyes. And even then, he wakes if the curtains are whispering wrong. In Elmbrook, one boy slept face down in what I believe was a turnip. And yes, I realize I sound like an old man, bemoaning the youth today. But something about their chaos had harmony. Something about their utter disregard for order made me briefly wish I'd once been allowed to sleep next to someone who snored about pastry. Sleep back then wasn't something anyone perfected. It wasn't measured with rings on your finger or soothing whale sounds from a device. It was just something you did when your body gave out, and perhaps there's something noble in that. The utterly unnoble surrender to exhaustion. No ritual, no control, just collapse. I remember thinking, as I heard one child fart himself awake and giggle uncontrollably before rolling back over, that I hadn't laughed in my sleep in years. Not since childhood. It's not since the night Giles. My dog was killed by the castle cook. Now let's talk about cleanliness, or, in the case of Elmbrook's children, the grand illusion of it. You see, in the modern world, cleanliness is an aesthetic, a lifestyle. There are soaps that smell like forests, towels with thread counts. Higher than most feudal levies, and entire stores dedicated to the art of not smelling like another person's boots. In Elmbrook,
Hygiene was...
Ioratino. Children here were not dirty in the way you or I might describe a smudge on a cheek, or a bit of jam on the collar. They were layered. Dirt under the nails? Yes, but also dirt around the nails. Dirt shaped like nails. Their faces were canvases of smudges and smears, occasionally highlighted by streaks of something greenish that may or may not have been moss. Nose crusts, mind you, were not a medical concern. They were badges. One boy had such a specimen glinting. On his upper lip, I could only admire the structural integrity of it. It caught the sunlight like a cathedral window. Bathing in the village was more of a seasonal group ritual than a regular habit. Public bathhouses existed, in theory, usually in towns with more horses than children, and often doubled as the gossip center. Syphilis incubator, an occasional site for morally ambiguous negotiations. But here in Elmbrook, bathing meant hoping it rained while you stood still. The river, such as it was, ran too cold in winter and too brown in summer. No one trusted it. Most villagers wiped themselves down with a damp rag and a look of grim resolve. Washing clothes involved boiling urine, not metaphorically. Actual urine, their soap lye, if they were lucky, was made of ashes and regret. It stripped dirt, yes, but also skin, dignity, and any memory of softness. If you ever wonder why. Medieval people look so serious in portraits, it's because they were still recovering from their last bath. Now, as for noble hygiene, let's not fool ourselves. We bathed more frequently than peasants in the same way that wolves bite more gently than lions. It's all teeth. As a child, I was scrubbed down once a fortnight if I'd been sufficiently pious, or if the local bishop was visiting. The water was brought in by 4 servants, and my bath was conducted with the pageantry of a small coronation. Lavender, rose petals, candles, all to disguise the fact that I had no idea what I was doing with a loofah carved from beechwood. There were ritualistic elements too. Prayers, Latin chants, the unfortunate presence of my aunt who insisted I was too young to bathe unchaperoned well into my adolescence, and even then, I wasn't clean. I was perfumed. I smelled like rosemary stuffed in a drawer, and somehow still had grime behind my ears. No one questioned this. It was simply understood that children, noble or not, were vessels of dirt. Barely disguised as humans, one of the Elmbrook girls had hair like a haystack after a storm. It stood out in directions that defied physics. I watched her scratch her scalp with a stick, and then tuck the stick behind her ear like a treasured tool. I cannot explain why this moved me. Perhaps because I once had a comb carved from ivory, a gift from an uncle who thought I needed taming, and I snapped it in half trying to detangle a curl. The stick was more effective, much more honest. And then there was the smell. Don't notice it at first. Your nose, like your pride, slowly gives up, but it's there. A bouquet of sweat, livestock, and something I can only describe as eternal cabbage. The children smelled like they'd been in an argument with a compost, heap and lost. Yet they carried this scent with the confidence of aristocrats. They didn't recoil. They didn't apologize. They didn't know, and maybe that's what hygiene really is. Not about being clean, but about being aware of being dirty. A modern child today would burst into tears if their sock touched a puddle. One of these Elmbrook boys fell face first into a pile of something that actively sizzled and got up grinning. Only slightly greener. I began to wonder what we'd actually gained. With all our cleanliness and caution. Yes, we smell better. We live longer. But do we live longer? There's something liberating about watching a child dig in the mud. With fingernails that haven't seen daylight in weeks. Something beautifully, horrifically honest. And when I returned to my saddlebag bed that night, I found myself brushing imaginary dirt from my cloak, not because I'd gotten any on me, but because I wanted to belong, if only a little. Now, let's talk about fun, or as it was known in Elmbrook, surviving with style. To the untrained eye, it looked like chaos. But there was a method to the mudslinging, the goat chasing, the stick battles that ended in arguments about whose turn it was to be the king. These children didn't have toys. They were the toys. A stick was a sword, a crown, a cursed relic, or all 3 at once depending on the mood. A patch of dirt became a castle, a prison, or on one particularly. Energetic morning, a bakery that sold nothing but imaginary pies made of gravel. One boy rode a bucket down a muddy hill. When it inevitably flipped, he declared the event a dragon attack and hobbled around making wounded night noises until dinner. It was, by all accounts, a very productive afternoon. They played with a kind of desperation, as if fun might run out if not used quickly. There were no rules, only volume. Games started without warning and ended with either a scream or someone falling asleep mid-chase. One game, which seemed to involve throwing a dead squirrel at each other, was referred to as Queen's Messenger. I didn't ask, and then there was the laughing. Loud, unfiltered, absurd laughter that burst out at the mere sight of someone stepping in something unfortunate. It was not polite laughter, not the restrained kind you hear at noble dinners when someone makes a witty remark about tariffs. This was full body, knee-slapping, no snorting joy, the kind that leaves you winded. Back at my manor, though fun was scheduled, supervised, sanitized, we were allowed to play lawn games in straight lines while wearing shoes that pinched and smiling. Only when addressed by name. My toys were carved from ivory and came with scrolls explaining their symbolic meaning. A wooden horse meant valor. A miniature lute meant refinement. A doll meant that someone had misunderstood what kind of child. I was no one played with me. They played around me. Servants, tutors, and the occasional distant cousin tasked with making sure I didn't fall into a duck pond. I did. Twice. In Elmbrook, children played together, in a pack, like wolves. Dirty, happy, bruised wolves with questionable snack choices. Their games were more than play. They were practice. Practice for sharing, for surviving, for losing, for forgiving. You could see it in the way a stolen turnip became a shared meal, or how the smallest child was always boosted onto the hay cart first, even if she bit fingers on the way up. And though I watched from a distance, part of me itched to join, to grab a stick and pretend it was a sword, to let go of the noble stiffness I'd worn since birth and just run without a destination, but I didn't, because dignity, because age, because my boots were new, and I'm fairly sure I'd sprained something within the first 10 seconds. Still, I envied them. Modern children, I imagine, have organized sports, foam swords, and screen time to negotiate. But I've seen the same boredom in their eyes that I once had. That feeling of being watched, even while playing, of performing joy instead of living it. In Elmbrook, no one watched. They participated. They howled. They fell. They got up. Repeated, they made their own stories. And in doing so, they remembered them. Not with photographs, not with trophies, but with scars and inside jokes, and the kind of bruises you point at 10 years later with pride. They knew, in a way that I had forgotten, that play was not a luxury. It was a rehearsal for life. A messy, glorious, splinter-filled rehearsal. And as the sun dipped behind the hills and the children returned to their puddle-soaked homes, I found myself smiling like an idiot, because someone, I think it was the bucket knight, had drawn a very wobbly crown in the mud. My name beneath it. Spelled wrong, of course. But still, a crown's a crown. It was on the second morning, just after a rooster had mistaken my ear for a sunrise, that I first saw them at work. The children of Elmbrook did not rise gently. There was no sleepy blinking, no cuddling of plush toys. They were on their feet like soldiers hearing the trumpet. Except instead of polished armor, they wore shirts with holes and expressions that said, "Let's just get it over with." Their chores began before the dew even considered drying. Buckets were hoisted, goats were chased into place, kindling was gathered with small hands that had never known a splinter-free day. One girl, no taller than my walking stick, was expertly gathering eggs, while simultaneously scolding a chicken with more authority than I'd ever managed in court. There was no praise, no gold star, no good job. You did the work or someone else had to do it, and no one wanted that. Even the littlest one, who might have still been figuring out what his own toes were for, dragged a broom around like it was his life's calling. He wasn't sweeping anything, but he was trying, and that seemed to be enough. I had never seen such coordinated exhaustion. Back in my own childhood, my chores had consisted of reciting family names and holding still during fittings. I once got scolded for sneezing during a portrait. A sneeze. It nearly ruined the drapery, and yet these children worked. Not because they were told, but because the village wouldn't run without them. They didn't get allowances. They didn't get screen time after. They got blisters and the occasional extra hunk of bread if the day went well. One boy, same one who'd grinned at me in the rain, was helping haul a water barrel. It took 3 of them to move it. So one pushed, one pulled, one shouted unhelpful advice. It was chaos. It was inefficient. It was beautiful. They learned by doing, by fumbling, by spilling half the milk and learning the hard way that cows do take offense. There was an unspoken understanding that if you didn't find your place in the machine, the whole thing shuddered. They weren't just pretending to be grown-ups. They were already part of the machinery of life, and as I watched them labor and learn, I wondered what skills my own children were mastering. Edmund could recite Latin oaths with perfect enunciation. Hugh had memorized all the family land holdings by county. Isolde knew the exact angle of a curtsy depending on the rank of the person she was greeting. Very impressive. Very useless. Could they milk a goat? Stitch a tear? Light a fire without bursting into tears? It's probably not. Even more astonishing was the way their talents were noticed, not with applause, not with ceremonies, but with a simple nod, a saved chore, a quiet "let her do it, she's better." One afternoon, I saw a girl mend a ripped tunic with such speed and precision. I wanted to hire her on the spot. She couldn't have been older than 10. She wasn't praised, just handed the next torn sleeve. But there was a flicker of pride on her face, like she'd just been knighted in secret. Modern children get medals for showing up, stickers for breathing. Here, pride came wrapped in mud, tied with sweat, and delivered without a single spoken word. I started to think of their chores not as burdens, but as building blocks. Little acts of capability stacked on top of each other until one day you looked up and you weren't a child anymore. You were useful, you were needed, you mattered. Children in Elmbrook didn't talk about feelings. Not because they were stoic philosophers in dirt-covered tunics, but because there was simply no time or language for it. If you liked someone, you shared your crust. If you hated someone, you threw it at them. And if you weren't sure, you just stared at them for several minutes until they either ran away or gave you a rock. I watched one boy, small, snot-nosed, perpetually barefoot, offer the last bite of his carrot to a girl who had just pushed him into a pile of something I truly hope was mud. No words, just a glance, a shrug, and the carrot. And she took it like this was the most natural thing in the world. They didn't hug, they tackled. They didn't say thank you. They grunted, and somehow it worked. Back in my childhood affection came in 3 forms: formal approval, distant smiles, and the occasional head pat from a parent who wasn't quite sure if you were theirs. My father once told me I was satisfactory. It was the emotional highlight of my year. We had tutors for every subject but empathy. Our toys had more eye contact with us than our parents. We were raised to be silent, reverent, and composed, preferably all at once, even while eating soup. In Elmbrook, I saw a kind of messy affection that bordered on violent devotion. One girl repeatedly tied and retied her little brother's tunic all morning, swatting away his hands when he tried. "To help you're hopeless," she muttered. But when another child tried to tease him, she whacked them with a ladle and returned to her sewing without a word. And I began to wonder, had I ever protected someone like that, without being asked, without even knowing why? They had no words for love, but it was there, in the way they worked beside each other, and how they didn't complain when sharing the same ragged blanket, and how the older ones made sure the younger ones always had the crustier end of the loaf, which somehow was the best part. They had nothing, but they had each other. Not in the embroidered, hand-holding, song-singing way nobles imagined peasant kinship, but in the elbow to the rib, snore in the rear, alpha to goot, for you sort of way. And maybe that's what matters more than manners or titles or family. Crests painted on shields no one could lift. Maybe love isn't about saying it or showing it perfectly. Maybe it's just being there, in the same space, enduring the same cold, taking turns, keeping the fire alive. What surprised me most, what truly snuck up on me like a goat in a cupboard, was how these children understood the world, or rather how they felt it. Time in Elmbrook wasn't kept. It happened. There were no bells ringing the hour, no. Pocket sundials, no one shouting, "Hurry, we're late for geometry." Morning began when the rooster screamed. Meals happened when someone noticed the pot had stopped boiling. Night fell when the sky turned the color of regret, and someone remembered to shut the door before the pigs wandered in. The children didn't count minutes. They counted moments. Rain meant staying in the barn. Sun meant chasing each other until someone tripped over a duck. The rhythm of the day moved around them like weather, unpredictable, messy, and mostly ignored. Modern children, from what I understand, have calendars busier than bishops. Playdates, enrichment sessions, cello practice squeezed between mindfulness exercises and gluten-free snacks. Elmbrook's children had sticks and a rock named Simon and the whole of the muddy earth to run on and their worldview. Oh, it was heartbreakingly simple. God was real. Bread was important. Grown-ups made the rules, and occasionally those rules involved not poking the oxen. The horizon ended at the forest's edge. Anything beyond that was dragons, war, or possibly a bigger village with even meaner goats. They didn't dream of court, or travel, or changing the world. They dreamed of not falling in the latrine, of getting the bigger bowl of stew, of learning to whistle properly. And somehow, it was enough. Their curiosity was feral, not school-shaped. One boy asked me if my cloak was made of wolf skin. I said no. He asked if I had killed the wolf anyway. I said I hadn't. He nodded solemnly. Then it wasn't your cloak. You try arguing with that logic. They didn't learn from scrolls. They learned from bleeding, from trying, from watching older siblings drop something and mutter a word they weren't supposed to know yet. Back at my manor, my children were quizzed on philosophy before they understood why leaves changed color. They could recite treaties, but couldn't catch a chicken. They'd never even seen a chicken. And yet here, a boy who had never held a quill showed more wisdom with a bent stick and a muddy grin than I had with years of tutors breathing down my neck. It made me think, perhaps uncomfortably, that growing up doesn't require polish. It's just presence, and that maybe, just maybe, Simon the Rock deserved more respect than most noblemen I'd met. On the morning I left Elmbrook, the road had turned into soup again, thick and brown, sucking at boots like it didn't want anyone to go anywhere. My cart, which had just begun to smell less like a sheep, was packed and rebalanced, and my servants were mumbling about missing mattresses and dry roofs. I stood at the edge of the barn, cloak fastened, boots cleaner than they deserved to be. The children were already deep into their routines, hauling, scolding, laughing, tripping over things. Simon the Rock had acquired a smaller rock companion, presumably named Simon Jr. No one said goodbye. That's not how Elmbrook worked. One of the boys just nodded at me. The same one from the rain, still barefoot, still grinning, as if to say, we knew you'd leave. It was fun watching you try to understand us. I gave him a nod back, the nobleman's version of a hug, and climbed aboard my cart. As we rattled away, mud splattering like applause, I looked back only once. The village already looked smaller, quieter, like it had absorbed me and then shrugged me off again, the way you shake a crumb out of your tunic. But I was not the same. Because somehow, amid all the filth and laughter and unsupervised, weaponized goats, I had learned something about what it meant to be young, about what it meant to grow. It's not in age, but in direction. I thought of my children, pale, polite, cloaked in silence, and I made a quiet vow to let them fall more, to let them fail, to let them chase things they couldn't name yet, even give them a stick and send them into the orchard unsupervised. Just once. Modern children are surrounded by warnings, by cushions, by fear dressed up as love. Children are surrounded by each other, and somehow that makes all the difference. So no. They didn't have scrolls or tutors or timepieces, but they had each other. They had Simon, and really, that might be enough. That evening, as my manor gates creaked open and the familiar scent of rose oil and boiled mutton greeted me, I found myself dreading the softness of my own bed. My steward met me with a stack of parchment complaints. My wife asked whether the goose for next week's banquet had been confirmed. The tutor barely acknowledged my return, too focused on making Edmund rewrite an entire passage from Cicero due to a smudge. And yet as I stood in the hall, half muddied and blinking at the chandelier like it had appeared overnight, I knew something had shifted. Ow. I had seen how laughter doesn't require fine linen, how lessons don't require chalkboards, and how strength can grow in little legs that haven't yet figured out left from right. The next morning, I asked the cook to let Isolde help in the kitchens, just once, just for the bread. I suggested to the tutor that Hugh skip his second lesson and walk in the garden instead. I told Edmund he didn't have to finish Cicero today, and for the first time, he looked at me like I might be someone worth knowing. No one understood what had gotten into me, but I did. A muddy village, a grinning child, a rock named Simon. So that's where I'll leave you tonight. Childhood is short, whether it's in the 14th century or today. It's loud, sticky, strange, and when we're lucky, full of wonder. Not perfect, but memorable in all the best and worst ways. If you've enjoyed this story, do consider leaving a comment. I'd be curious to hear where in the world you're listening from and what time of night it is as your eyes get heavy. And of course, subscribe for more tales of mud, mischief, and all the miseries of history that somehow still make us smile. Sleep well. Good night.